Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm going to give it just 30 seconds as we see people popping in. Excited to hear about the benefits of electrification in their everyday lives, and we're looking forward to getting the webinar underway. All right. Well, thank you to the many of you who are joining us today for today's webinar, Back in the Race, What New Data Reveals About Electrifying Your Home and Car. I'm Rachel Doran. I'm the Executive Director at Clean Energy Canada. If you don't know us, we're a think tank at Simon Fraser University, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver, BC. Now, I'm just going to give you a few housekeeping items while folks are checking in. If you have any technical questions at any time, you can ask them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My colleague Kira Torrance will provide support at any time throughout the webinar if you're having any challenges. We'll also be welcoming your questions in the final 30 minutes or so of the webinar. You'll be muted throughout, so please submit those questions through that same Q&A icon. And feel free to ask a question anytime. We'll be compiling them for later, and we can't wait to hear what strikes your interest as we chat. Finally, we'll be circulating a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides to all those who registered. Feel free to share them widely, and we'll also include a link to Clean Energy Canada's amazing weekly newsletter, which we circulate with the top clean energy transition events of the previous week, and it arrives in your inbox Monday morning. And if you haven't signed up for it, I highly recommend doing so. But now to the topic at hand. Since it's almost Earth Day, I assume everyone who's taken the time to join us today will likely already know that electrifying our homes and transportation is an important climate solution. Our research shows just how significant the impact can be. Fully electrifying a household, both home and vehicles, can cut emissions by about 97% in Vancouver, 93% in Toronto, and 99% in Montreal compared to conventional technologies. But as we've seen Canadians facing higher costs at the pump, what might be even more critical is showing that through electrification, they don't need to face these new challenges. In fact, according to our new Clean Energy Canada report, switching to technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps can save households hundreds of dollars per month. The economics of EVs in particular have improved dramatically in a matter of just the past couple of months. With the return of the $5,000 federal rebate, rising gas prices, some models now save drivers well over $30,000 in 10 years. And what's more, they pay back their upfront cost in just over 2 years if you consider those kind of high gas price considerations. So today, you're going to be hearing from a number of my talented colleagues. You'll hear from Clean Energy Canada's Director of Insights and Communications, Trevor Melanson, our Senior Policy Advisor, Jana Elbrecht, and Policy Advisor Denise Lee, who will each present some of the report's main findings. We're going to show you a little bit about our revised website, mycleanbill.ca, our findings on total cost of ownership with a deep dive into EVs and heat pumps. And after that, we're excited to answer your questions, and we suspect you'll have many. Again, please do submit those questions through the Q&A function throughout the webinar at any time. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Trevor to talk about our new website and our report.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to start with there we go, quick refresher here. So mycleanbill.ca, it's our online calculator that helps Canadians see how much they could save by switching to clean technologies, in particular, though not exclusively, electric vehicles and heat pumps based on their household and by comparing them to their fossil fuel equivalents. And once again, the headline finding here is really clear. Canadians across the country can save hundreds of dollars every month by switching to clean energy options. But since we last ran these numbers in 2024, certain policy changes have shifted the math on clean heating in some parts of the country, namely the loss of a federal and some provincial incentives and the elimination of the consumer carbon price. And while EVs offer the biggest financial savings, heat pumps also deliver other benefits, from lower bills in many, if not all scenarios, to improved comfort, better cooling, and more evenly distributed heating. And importantly, real-world experience backs this up. 91% of Canadian heat pump owners say they'd recommend one. And we'll have more on that survey very soon. So, what are we actually comparing? Now, on the vehicle side, we're looking at electric cars versus their gas equivalents. And for homes, we're looking at heating and cooling, water heating, in appliances like induction stoves, along with savings like avoiding gas connection costs if you fully electrify your house. So the goal here is to give a full picture of what electrifying your home and vehicles looks like from a cost perspective. I'll also briefly mention now that our full methodology is in the report, so do take a look there if you have specific methodological questions so we can keep the discussion later a bit more high level. Now, here's a look at our updated, revamped MyCleanBill website, designed to make these findings tangible. So instead of just looking at, a Canadian average, you can actually see what switching could really mean for an individual household, your household, what that could save and what options might make sense for you and where to get started. We have resources on the website as well. So, as before, users can enter things like their province, their housing types, vehicle information. But what's new now this year is the ability to toggle results and dig into more detailed breakdowns. So you can see exactly how costs and emissions change depending on the technologies that you choose. It makes it much easier to compare different pathways and understand where savings are actually coming from. So now we've got a fun little video here. Here will help me get this video moving and we'll just talk through it so you can see what the new website looks like. So you can choose your province here, your type of home, click next, how many vehicles you drive, and the types of vehicles. So like an economy car and a SUV in this case, you see your clean bill. I noticed all these toggles that you can turn on and off now. And we have these little information icons as well that tell you more about what we mean by certain things to give you that right level of transparency for users. And of course, you can click the view details button here and you get even more information. And if you toggle these, if you fully electrify, you'll see that natural gas connection cost goes away. But if you add even one gas-based appliance, then you're paying that every month. Again, we have rebate information depending on your jurisdiction. So you select what province you live in, or if you've already gone through the tool, it knows what province you're in and it sends you to a regionalized rebate page. We've got a benefits page here as well, where you can see for individual technologies, just some what the high level benefits of these tech are, because again, we noted heat pumps aren't just cheaper in some scenarios, they're actually better technologies. We want to highlight that. And finally, we have an FAQ section as well that just answers a lot of questions that people might have about what this tool is. And of course, if they really want to dig into it, they can go right to the report and look at the methodology. So it's a bigger, more robust, more transparent website. I'd say the early numbers we're seeing on our back end are quite promising as well. And we're seeing high levels of conversion of people actually going all the way through this calculator. All right, just clicking the next button here. I think it's a little bit stuck on the video. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry, slight lag. That's the second takeaway. All right, back to key takeaway one. So let's talk about the study. Let's talk about the big takeaways that we found. So the math on buying an EV was already good, but it just got even better for two main reasons. The $5,000 federal rebate is back for electric cars, and the war in Iran is driving up gas prices. So here's an example. In January, the Chevy Equinox EV version would have saved drivers $22,000 versus the gas Equinox over 10 years. Now, just a few months later, that savings number is $34,000. That's a $2,000 difference. Okay, that's the combination of a $5,000 rebate and an average gas price that is significantly higher now than it was a few months ago. And I think this is really key is the EV now earns back its higher upfront cost with fuel savings after just 2 years and 4 months compared to 5 years previously. It's always the case that electric cars are cheaper overall, but I think what sells a lot of people is when you bring that savings closer to today. And one way of doing that you see here is when the break-even point is only a couple years out. That's something you can wrap your head around as opposed to savings that you only realize 5, 10 years down the road. Second takeaway here is Canada's EV market is was fundamentally uncompetitive last year, and we're finally starting to see that turn around as part of this federal government's auto strategy. Automakers are dropping prices to come in under the new incentives $50,000 eligibility price cap. That's something we've noticed when we're looking at, we always look at the price tags of all these vehicles when we're doing this analysis. And so we could see, in fact, we had to update the report at the last minute because we were waiting to see automakers adjust their prices for this incentive cap. We saw the RAV4 plug-in hybrid go down and the Mitsubishi Outlander go down to almost certainly come in under the eligibility price cap of the plug-in hybrid rebate is one example. So that's one way an incentive cap can actually push down prices of certain vehicles that are right on the line. Similarly, we hope that Chinese EVs will be likely cost competitive without federal rebates based on looking at how they're priced in other jurisdictions. That's good news because they're not going to be eligible for receiving rebates. There's a requirement, of course, that rebates only apply to cars from countries that have a free trade agreement with Canada. Takeaway number three, by excluding EVs over $50,000, I just mentioned that, as well as those from China, the rebate targets middle class models where the upfront cost differential is the highest. Okay, this is interesting. So the BMW i4, it's about $65,000 and it's excluded from the program. It's well over that. But that's only about $2,500 more than its gas equivalent. So the end result is that BMW's breaking even in like a year anyway. Now we saw that as well with the Chevy truck as well. So on the sort of more expensive end, even the Kia EV9, the price gap wasn't as big. All the vehicles that we had in the list that were not eligible actually had a smaller price gap, and we're seeing bigger overall savings and quicker break-even points. Contrast that with what I would call these middle class cars, the Kia EV4, the Hyundai Kona, the Chevrolet Equinox. These have pre-rebate prices of $12,000 to $15,000 higher. Again, that's before the $5,000 rebates applied than their gas counterparts. So rebates are actually closing price gaps where they're the biggest and the most needed, because this is the category of cars, of course, that so many Canadians are actually looking at. Finally, key takeaway four, heat pumps still save money in many scenarios across Canada, especially compared to oil and conventional electric heating like baseboards. But in provinces where we compared it to natural gas, heat pumps range from cost savings in BC to comparable, slight cost, but comparable in Ontario, to a very clear cost in the prairies. So, we need government leadership, but we also need to highlight that there are other benefits of of getting a heat pump, right? So, if the cost is similar, it's worth considering what is a better system, what's going to be more comfortable. 91% of heat pump owners would recommend one to the neighbor. Um, this is an exciting survey that we did, I believe, a first of a kind. Jana's going to talk about later on the call. And the most common benefits that were cited were better cooling, lower bills, improved comfort, and more even heating. So it's about more than just cost. Now, behold our map of maps. Here, we're looking at a single household in a detached house with one economy car and one medium SUV. On the car side, EVs save big money everywhere from $360 in Alberta to $507 in Quebec. But the home electrification side is more complicated. First, it's important to understand that our model uses the most common heating type in every province, and the only place where a heat pump beats natural gas among our scenarios is in BC. Heat pumps were clear money savers in places where we used oil heating and conventional electric, but the math is trickier when it comes to gas, as I said, especially in the prairies, which we decided against including because there simply wasn't a good cost argument to be made here. In Ontario, it's closer, and we therefore included that result because in reality, every home is different and heat pumps aren't just about the money. There are also better systems, and again, Jana's going to talk about that. I'm sure some of you have questions about these results, and we'll be happy to answer them shortly. But now I'm going to hand the mic to Denise to dive into our exciting electric vehicle results, including some fun new scenarios that we ran this year exclusively.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah, it was a very exciting time for EVs this year. The big takeaway is that EVs save the average Canadian $23,000 to $32,000 over the vehicle lifetime. So this range is based on the size and model of the vehicle, with larger vehicles tending to save more than their gasoline counterparts because of their higher fuel consumption. So, for example, in this slide here, we have the Chevy Equinox. And over its vehicle lifetime, over 10 years, they saved $27,000. And this is despite the fact that its purchase price is $12,000, the EV version, over the gasoline one. But that gap really shrinks once we include that $5,000 rebate. And also, we really take into account those fuel savings. And these results were done, as mentioned earlier, at a 2025 average gas price of $1.42. If we factor in the current gas prices, you would add an additional $7,000 over this vehicle lifetime. So, fuel is a very big part of this. And another big contributor is the maintenance savings of an EV because they lack many of the mechanical components that require regular servicing in a fossil fuel vehicle, such as oil changes or cooling system flushes. You also save about half of those costs when driving an EV. So these really translate to real savings. If we were to imagine, for example, commuting in Toronto, where I am based, and we ignore all other driving, the monthly savings on a commute alone from Ajax to downtown or Hamilton to Mississauga is about $150 to $250 just on that commute alone. So these, high level lifetime savings really translate to monthly supports for a lot of households in Canada. We also expanded this analysis to look at vehicles across different size segments, but also for vehicles outside of Canada. So, following the federal announcement that a number of Chinese EV models may soon be available to Canadians, we looked at how the Hyundai Kona compares to a Chinese Chery E5 and also a French Citroën EC3. And we saw that Canadian EVs are actually now competitive to a lot of these international, more affordable models because of that $5,000 rebate. And finally, just to really kind of go all in on nerding out, we also looked at how every powertrain compares for a Toyota model. So there has been a lot of discussion about how conventional hybrid vehicles, which are purely run by gasoline but have a more efficient engine, compared to EVs. And we saw that the more electrification and the way the powertrain is ranked really is showcased in this comparison. So battery electric vehicles in that top left-hand corner saved $26,000 over the vehicle lifetime compared to a gasoline Toyota RAV4. A plug-in hybrid, because of its higher retail price and lower electricity or gas savings, only saves about $10,000 to $12,000 depending on how much you drive it on its electric powertrain. And a hybrid RAV4 only saves about $6,000 compared to a non-hybrid RAV4. So really the takeaway is that EVs win across the board. And again, a lot of these results are conservative, considering they were based on 2025 figures. So I think for EVs, luckily this year especially, this was a big win. I will pass that on over to Yana to showcase how heat pumps compare.
Thank you, Denise. So I think this has been promised by Trevor early on that I would talk about some of the other benefits of heat pumps, and this is really something that we wanted to highlight in the report this year. So beyond the cost savings, how do people experience their electrified homes? And together with Summerhill, an energy services company here in Canada, we did a first of its kind Canada-wide heat pump owner survey. And I think you've heard this first stat a couple times this webinar and hopefully before that already, which is that overwhelmingly people love their heat pumps. So 91% said they would recommend one to their neighbors or friends. Definitely more than half were very happy. Overwhelming majority were very happy or somewhat happy. And when we asked people what drove them to get a heat pump, we found that yes, some people do it to save the environment, to lower their carbon footprint. But actually, some of the more practical drivers came out more dominant. So that is those lower energy bills and adding cooling. And it was actually those same practical benefits that people cited when we asked them about their experience. So improved cooling, but also a more even heating, improved heating. Um, and again, the majority reported only benefits when we asked them about their experience. And then there were groups who had reported both benefits and some drawbacks, or a small group that reported only issues. And when we look at those issues, the most common ones included the system's noisier than I would like, and some concerns about maintenance. Will my heat pump work in the cold? And ice buildup. But what's interesting here is that, of course, experiences really differ because heat pump covers a wide range of systems, wide range of homes. So one example here is that even though noise was the most reported issue, an even larger group said that their heat pump was actually quieter than their previous system. Um, and actually, one more thing that I wanted to mention when we talk about that cold weather performance, we sent out this heat pump survey during the winter. And if for those of you who are based in Ontario, like I am, you might remember that last or second to last January weekend when we had knee-high snow, it was minus 20 degrees outside. And that actually happened to be the same weekend that Hydro One sent out our survey to their customers. And so we got a really large number of respondents from Ontario on that exact weekend. And among those people, when we asked them, would you recommend a heat pump to their neighbor? We still got 92% of them saying, yes, I like this system. I would recommend it. So overall, I think that's a resounding endorsement of heat pumps, even in Canadian winters. Yeah, and then when we look at one of those reported benefits, so lower energy bills, this actually aligns very well with our modeling. So as Trevor mentioned, it differs across the country. And so only in 5 provinces did we compare it to natural gas, but there it was a bit of a mixed bag. And we see that fewer people who replace a natural gas system report lower bills as one of the benefits. But then when we look at households replacing an oil furnace or an electric system like baseboards, a lot of people, when we asked, what do you like about your heat pump, said lower energy bills. So again, it really depends on your exact situation, but a common-sided benefit. One other cool finding that I want to show is what might point to a little bit of a snowball effect. So we asked people, are you making any other upgrades? And we found that more than half of respondents who had a heat pump installed also had made improvements to their insulation, their air tightness of their home, and more than the Canadian average had made other steps in home electrification. So replacing a gas stove, purchasing an EV, or solar panels. And that really points to this idea that, once you start electrifying, once you get one efficient technology and you see the benefits, it might really spark that thought to take the next steps. And then the last finding I'll share from the survey, and again, the report is on the website, so please check it out because there's more in there. We found that rebates still matter. So over half of respondents in our survey made use of a government support program. Most of them were provincial or federal or a combination of both. And when we asked people who had made use of a rebate, more than half of that group said they would not have installed a heat pump without the incentive, mostly because they could not have afforded to do so. So helping households overcome that upfront cost barrier is still definitely crucial. And with that, I'll jump into some of our recommendations. I'll keep it high level here. Again, more details in the report, but also really happy to dive into more details in the Q&A. But broadly, the 4 buckets of recommendations are we need to help households overcome that upfront cost barrier. So that is rebates, but that's also thinking about solutions like low interest financing or bulk purchasing, get a little more creative with it. Secondly, we need to make the efficient option and the electric option the easy option. Thirdly, we need to set the right conditions. So whether that is avoiding households having to make expensive upgrades to their electrical panel, or making sure we have qualified installers. And then finally, there's still a lot of work to be done in communication. So in an earlier survey, we found that Canadians don't have a lot of info about the many benefits of heat pumps. And the more they learn, the more likely they are to say they'd be willing to adopt one. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of communications and information there. And with that, I'll hand it over to Denise to give us some recommendations on the EV side.
Thanks, Yana. For EVs, even though they do win out on its lifetime cost, the upfront cost can still be a barrier for many Canadians. So the first recommendation is to still try to find ways to tackle that price gap, especially for those smaller vehicles that have a larger one. So that can include point of sale rebates, like the one that is currently available at the federal level. Provinces can also chip in, lower no interest loans, leasing programs, as well as reducing charging costs as well through time of use electricity rates, like in Ontario, where overnight rates are much lower, which particularly benefit EVs. Another way to support EV adoption is to ensure Canadians have greater access to a wider number of EV models. So that can be done through stronger regulation that supports EV adoption, such as strong tailpipe emission or EV availability standards, or welcoming in foreign EV models like we've seen with the recent announcement with Chinese EVs, or from other jurisdictions like the EU by aligning vehicle safety standards so they're certified for the Canadian market. And finally, charging is a big part. The ease and convenience and cost of charging can also be tackled by either having EV readiness requirements for our residential buildings. So it is easy for anybody who buys an EV to be able to install a charger in their home, or for funding or regulation to help people with existing buildings be able to add that in. And secondly, funding in the form of programs, financing, or investment tax credits to support public chargers as well, so that in the event that you're on the road and are driving for particularly long distance, you also have options to top up. And I'll hand it back to Rachel.
Great. Well, I will invite all of our panelists to actually turn their cameras back on because now's the time we get to all of your questions. And so thank you to all those who've been really active in the Q&A during the presentation portion. I'll just remind you, as I see one hand up from an audience member, we can't accept questions live as your microphones will be muted, but feel free to continue popping questions into that Q&A, and we're just going to keep taking them until the end of the hour. So for starters, I guess I'll just say I saw one comment in here saying, do you folks have something that I can just distribute, an easy one-pager for the outreach network that I could share with friends and family and others this summer? The answer is not yet, but I think it's a great idea. And so the team will take that one back and happy to, if you're registered for our newsletter, or our outreach network, make sure you're tuning in because we always share new resources that are available both through our organization and through other organizations through that channel. But Trevor, I'm going to turn the first one to you. The first couple questions were really about this tool and sort of what our approach is to updating it and changing it over time. So first, someone asked, how often will you update this over time given programs and policies do change? And a second one was more around kind of customization. So are you planning a version that will make kind of tailored, explicit assumptions so people can really calculate the costs and benefits for their home of something like solar or a heat pump?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and whoever asked that question. Um, our intention is certainly to update this once a year. It went about a year and a half since the initial update, and part of that, as everyone here on the call could tell you, is we meant to get it out last year, but we kept waiting for an update on the EV incentive. We went through a federal election. There was so much uncertainty, and it really helped when we finally got clarity on that EV rebate. Is a major component of this calculation. But going forward, we definitely want to have an update every single calendar year. There may be times where there's a small thing that happens in the world that's somewhat impactful, and then we just make a quick update to the calendar. So I don't want to say we're restricting ourselves exclusively to once a year, but we're making a very deliberate effort to update it once a year, and to also to answer the second question, rethink it a little bit. I think this is the second version. There'll be a third version. And I think it's something we want to iterate on. We want to make it better. This website is better than it was last time. And next year, we'll find ways to make it better again. I mean, I'll say one of, in my view, the biggest limitations of the tool in its current form is you can only select the most common heating type in your province. So if you're among the, I think, 40% of British Columbians who are on electric heating, you're not really represented. You're kind of forced to choose natural gas. So that's a limitation, but it requires us going back to our modeler and figuring out how to do that and bringing it in. So absolutely. We are going to keep making the tool bigger and better and give you more options. I would say the target, though, of the tool is very much regular people who are just high level thinking about this and giving them a sense of what it could mean cost wise and what the benefits are, as opposed to a more complicated energy planner that somebody that's undertaking a deep renovation might want to use. So I think those are two different tools, and our tool is very much meant for the masses, meant for people to get an idea and to see what resources might be available to them.
Thanks, Trevor. And keep your mic on here because you might want to chime in, but I'll turn to Denise first. There have been lots of questions in the chat here around our methodology on EVs. So I'm going to throw a few to you and then I'll pass it over to Trevor as well, see if he wants to add anything in. So there were some questions about maintenance and repairs, noting that maybe they weren't specifically different. How is charging infrastructure incorporated into EV affordability benefits? And have you looked at the difference in car insurance payments?
Yeah, thanks for all the interest. So on maintenance and repairs, we took an average figure across kind of all EVs and all gas vehicles, and that was factored into our modeling. And so overall, you can see if you look in the report, we have kind of a bar graph split up into sections for how that cost breaks down in a like per gas liter kind of scenario. So you can see that the ratio of EVs versus some gas vehicles is about 40% lower. So that's how it's factored into that calculation. We didn't include the cost of charging infrastructure in these calculations, but we do assume that 88% of charging comes from home and 12% comes from public charging. So the cost of home chargers can really vary depending on if you live in a certain type of home, or if that ease, that retrofitting, if that's required, or how easy it is. But for the most part, for most people who have access to home charging, that cost is minimal compared to the kind of whole EV calculation ownership cost. And I think if I miss any other questions there, I'm very happy to answer them. But overall, what we've seen in this calculation is that the biggest factors are the cost of the vehicle, the cost of fuel or electricity as a comparison. And there are other factors also factored into this, but it is a much smaller portion of the differential between powertrains.
Yeah, I believe we used a study that looked at average depreciation costs among electric vehicles. That we initially took this work done by, I think it was Atlas Public Policy, and we kind of altered the tool over time and made it their own. And there was a a maintenance study in that. Somebody had asked about depreciation as well, and we went back and forth, including with some folks at Enercan, and trying to decide how to do this. And I think the most defensible way we found was just to treat depreciation equally across powertrains. There was a lot of variability in it, and it's really uncertain what depreciation will look like over time. So it seemed to us the fairest way to not give privilege to either type of vehicle.
I've got two more on this topic, which was, did we include Alberta's new annual tax on fully electric vehicles? And have we taken, maybe on the downside and on the upside, have we taken into consideration rebates from home EV charging suppliers like United Chargers when calculating cost savings?
Yeah, great question. So all of these figures, most of that data was taken from 2025 figures. So we did not include this Alberta EV tax. And because we don't take into account charging infrastructure costs, we also didn't include Any rebates that might have to do with whether it's, assessments of home charging, like an EV ready rebate, or the actual cost of the charger or any retrofits. Again, that can really vary depending on the type of home you have, or even down to the way the wiring looks in your building. So that would be an additional cost that can vary based on the person.
I would note, though, there are studies that show that the vast majority, I think one in Calgary done, the vast majority of drivers can get by on level one charging. So I think that, level two charging is great, but it is not something where it's a baked in cost. I almost think that's there's a little bit of light misinformation. And there's nothing wrong with, I have a level two charger. It's great. I don't even need it. I have it. But I think that a lot of cars come with a level one charger, or it's a very cheap purchase. So it's not necessarily the case that there's this like big additional cost if you have an EV. Most people definitely don't drive so much that they actually even need the level two charger, even though again, they're great and convenient.
Thanks. I'm going to throw one more to EVs to the two of you, and then Yana, I've got a couple on heat pumps for you. So another participant asked, do you have any tips for overcoming mis and disinformation around EVs, i.e. they don't work in cold climates, ranges are limited, and I will note I popped a link to our website resources into the Q&A chat, but maybe either of you want to speak a little bit to, what we do hear a lot of, which is mis and disinformation around EVs.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the first thing I'll highlight is that the best thing to counter EV misinformation is to drive one or kind of encounter one. So we often discuss the neighbor effect, which is if somebody kind of living in your community or someone buys an EV, suddenly everyone in that circle becomes very EV educated because this is a new technology that they've now, kind of heard firsthand from someone they trust and understand how the technology works and how those cost savings are real and realized. And so one of the best things that can happen is programs where people get to interact with EVs, or broader EV adoption in a certain area will also really help to showcase the technology. And the examples such as like EV test drives or kind of community events where EVs will be present has been one of the big initiatives of many organizations in Canada to really push that forward. And of course, reports like ours also try to show that data and kind of demonstrate that firsthand as to how this looks from a whole vehicle lifetime perspective.
Yeah, I would echo what Denise said. I think it's important that we battle misinformation. Absolutely. But I think it's not necessarily given that it's the biggest barrier to adoption. I think when EV sales are down, people think, well, people are buying into these bits of misinformation, and that must be the reason. But we've always seen this chasm between people who say they're open to getting an EV and actual EV sales. I think the biggest gap, and the one that we really need to zero in on, is people who actually would like to go electric and feel they can't for some reason. This is so many people who live in apartment buildings or who just can't quite stomach the upfront cost. So I think you unlock those barriers, and you'll find there are just so many Canadians who aren't really eating that misinformation up and are ready and willing to do this if it makes sense for them. And then to Denise's point, once you kind of get that adoption snowball rolling and people see, oh, this electric car is actually totally fine, there's just nothing in the world more persuasive than that firsthand experience. And in a study that we did last year in the GTHA and Metro Vancouver, one thing we saw, for example, we asked people, do you know someone with an electric car and have you been in it? And people who said yes to that question were statistically significantly more likely to say they were inclined to get an electric car. And interestingly, that was true across voters for every single political party.
Great. Well, I think one participant noted, Yana, that while a vehicle, maybe you have a little more time to think about what you might want to get and when you might want to get it. But do you have any advice for someone getting a heat pump in an emergency? So many people end up with a new gas furnace because it was what was available when their old one broke on a cold night in February. So, and do you want to provide any thoughts or comments to this problem, which I think is a real one around heat pumps?
Yeah, this is definitely a real one that we think about a lot. It's I still haven't found a well-cited statistic, but the number that goes around is that something like 80 to 90% of replacements of heating systems happen in an emergency, which might be, that someone I think in the chat said Friday night in February, and you don't really want to start researching HVAC systems then. You just want to kind of call your installer and get your heat back on. So, for a homeowner, I'd recommend start thinking about it when your furnace is maybe 12, 14, 15 years old. Start thinking about what you want to do next. But from the policy perspective, I think this is why we're thinking about how do we make the efficient electric option the easy one. Ultimately, that might be moving towards regulation of heating systems, at least maybe in new buildings. One solution that we're looking at in particular right now is a lot of people, and someone else in the Q&A mentioned this as well, about the prairies. A lot of people are installing cooling because we're seeing hotter and hotter summers. And when you think about a central air conditioning system, that is a heat pump. An AC is a heat pump, just a heat pump that only works one way, only does the cooling, but it's the same technology. So one thing we could very easily do is say, let's make sure that anyone who installs a central AC, so we're not talking about the dingy window units that you pop in really quickly, but the central ducted ones, that all of those people get one that can both heat and cool, also known as a heat pump. So those are some of the policy solutions that we're looking at to make it easier, because we don't want people to wait in the cold for multiple weeks for waiting for a heat pump installer to be available.
Thanks, Jan. I'm going to give you one more on heat pumps. There was also a question about how would you persuade a homeowner who's interested in getting a heat pump but isn't sure if they want to put in the investment as they might sell their home in the next few years. So what's your marketing technique?
Well, I don't know if I'm a good marketer, but I have seen some research out of the UK where they looked at actually increased home values through installation of heat pumps and solar panels. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but they did find a little bit of a premium effect there. And I think that makes sense. If I am looking at a new home right now, I'd be thinking about one that's comfortable to live in and that has affordable energy bills. And so I think in selling your home, that can be a benefit to say this already has a state-of-the-art heating and cooling system installed. No need to change that in a few years. I think that could definitely be a benefit, maybe especially if you're planning on reselling that home.
I think there's something, the even heating aspect is quite compelling. It's one of those things that seems abstract until you actually experience it. So a heat pump puts out hot air that's around like 35 Celsius. A gas furnace is more like, I think, 55, roughly. So the difference is the heat pump is putting out a warmer, more lukewarm air more constantly, and the gas furnace is basically dumping in very hot air it's mixing hot and cold, right? Dumping really hot air to bring the temperature up and then stopping, waiting for the temperature to climb, and then dumping that hot air back in. And that does make a real difference. So here's an example. One of our colleagues who helped us work on this report, for example, he got a heat pump installed to replace his gas furnace. And he said one of the things he loved about it, which I don't think he necessarily fully anticipated, was the fact that his gas furnace, his upstairs, he's in townhouse, his upstairs was always just hot. And so you're sleeping up there and you're not sleeping as well because the heat's rising, there's more temperature differences, and the bottom level was always ice cold. And he said since installing the heat pump, the entire house from the first to the third floor is just much more comfortable. I think about someone like my mother who's very temperature sensitive, and that's the kind of benefit I think they can really put someone over the line, because that's the most important thing in a heating system. That's what a heating system or a cooling system is all about, is actual comfort.
Can I jump back in here, Rachel? I also saw another question in the chat about someone who just installed a heat pump and was like, I don't know how to manage the system. And I think that's kind of the counterpart of what Trevor is saying, is that the heating does and cooling does work differently. And so even once we convince someone to install a heat pump, there's still an information piece there, which is it's meant to continuously be comfortable rather than turn on the heat, turn on the cooling, and that on-off switching that you might do with an AC or a furnace. And so some of the experiences also in our survey were very like, I don't feel heat coming out of the vents. And it's like, it's because it's not supposed to be that blast effect. So there's also a little bit of learning about, this is a more comfortable system, but you need to learn to expect it to work a little bit differently. So to the Q&A question there, I'm not an installer, so definitely ask your installer specifically how to manage your heat pump, but don't turn it on and off. Just keep it steady.
Thanks, Yana. I'm going to pivot a little bit here to some other technologies that we didn't talk about today. So a couple questions came in around, is Clean Energy Canada going to do comparisons for solar panels? What about a focus on battery storage in people's homes with or without solar panels so people can have a way to keep power on? And so maybe I would take moderator's privilege here and say, I think Clean Energy Canada has been doing a lot of work, particularly on like how do households interact with the electricity grid and what is a modern house, going to look like where you could have the ability to produce energy, store it, and then use it through all these kind of electrified end uses. It doesn't exist in our calculator today, but we will be doing a little more research this summer, which we're happy to share with folks, trying to engage in people's opinions about some of these maybe less known technologies out on the market today. And I don't know, Trevor, if you want to say anything about that work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that the way people think about electricity right now, it's just something that it's just produced and it's sent over to me through power lines. That's the full extent of my understanding. And obviously, a relationship with energy, with electricity, is going to be very fundamentally different, more dynamic, more controlling of peak loads with smart technologies, with vehicle to grid charging that makes you a more autonomous member of the electricity system and not just a receiver of electricity. That's a fundamental shift in how people think about the electricity system. And it actually it comes right down to the home level. So I think that because that's a complicated topic, we feel that focus groups are the best way of getting at that, as opposed to a poll. So you can actually kind of talk through these concepts and see how people are processing them. That is something we're undertaking this summer. It's going to be a bigger and a bigger thing. It is going to be a thing when we talk about modern EVs. 5 years from now, we're definitely going to be talking about vehicle to grid charging and what financial benefits might exist to doing that. So this tool is going to keep evolving to meet the moment, whatever that moment is. And as things become more and more mainstream, I'm not sure about solar panels right now, perhaps. Hard to say. We're very zeroed in on the kinds of technologies we think that a large share of Canadians would be interested in adopting, but everything is on the table and we just want to make it a little better every year.
Thanks, Trevor. Going to go back over to you, Denise, on EVs. There's been a couple of questions here about, okay, but what about people who live in apartments and condos, which is a topic we've worked on a lot. Home charging is more challenging there. And so can you speak a little bit to someone's comment on could you change the building code around this? What are the solutions?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of background, when we talk about home charging, we're talking about having a parking spot that has, the wiring from a building to a plug that you can put a home charger in. So that tends to be pretty easy for people who live in detached homes because you almost always have a parking spot, potentially a garage next to it, and you have the authority to change that house as you like. You can paint it whatever color you want. You can add as many plugs as you want without somebody else's permission. That changes when we look at multi-unit residential buildings. So we're talking about, large condo buildings where there might be a strata or a condo board. And so one of the things that usually happens when you live in one of these buildings and you want to have home charging is you might have to submit a proposal to the condo board, just getting approval for these changes. And that can be difficult because sometimes your condo board doesn't know much about EV charging, and there might need to be some initiative on kind of the individual's part for this. So, one of the best things that can happen is to build buildings with the basic EV infrastructure already there. This is referred to as an EV ready requirement, which means that when they build the building in the very early construction stages, you already have the basic infrastructure for every parking spot there. So again, just the basic wiring to a plug at every parking spot, not including an EV charger. And doing that at the time of construction is much, much cheaper than retrofits down the line. It could cost about $600 to $1,500 per spot, as opposed to a few $1,000s, really varying at the retrofit level depending on the configuration of your parking lot and a lot of kind of individual building factors. So just to answer that, one of the best things that government can do to really offer mass home charging access is to support a requirement like that in the building code or in other parts of legislation, the construction code potentially, to allow all these new buildings to be future proofed for the EV transition. As for people already living in existing buildings, one of the techniques that can take place is to try to put the word out across all the residents in the building to try to do if a retrofit, kind of a retrofit all at once for multiple parking spots. The idea is that to work together to try to lower those individual costs, and to also go through that admin process of speaking to your condo board kind of as a collective really helps to demonstrate the benefits of EV charging, to demonstrate the demand that takes place there. So there are some unique challenges, but there are a lot of policy options in place, and you can read more about it. As mentioned, Clean Energy Canada has done several reports on this, and I can send that into the chat for anyone interested.
Thanks, Denise. So Yana, you're going to glow when I say in the chat, we're hearing about what is the embodied carbon management of buildings, and can you do life cycle assessments of vehicles? So maybe just for context here, there's some folks asking about a lot of the technologies we're talking about are helping improve the energy that you use in your home, but what about the kind of like carbon footprint of the homes that we build? And then maybe on Denise afterwards, sometimes some of the questions we get about EVs are they really good for the environment? What about all the energy that goes into making a battery? So, like, are EVs actually better over the full course of their life, not just like as you drive them? So, maybe Yana and then Denise, do you want to speak to either of those?
Yes, I mean, I feel like the interest is more on the EV side, but I'm always happy to talk about the need to also start thinking about how we build homes with lower emissions. So whether that is using more efficient materials, thinking about how we build and how we design our homes. Um, so yeah, separately from electrifying them and using efficient technologies, using lower carbon building materials is also very important. So happy to we'll be coming out with a new study on that in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that.
Awesome. And on the EV side of things, so from a lifetime standpoint, EVs save about 70 to 77% of emissions compared to a gas vehicle. And that range depends on where in Canada you are. So some provinces have cleaner grids, and so that reduces the emissions of an EV even more. And the way that kind of proportion looks is that at the time of the vehicle production, EVs do have slightly higher emissions because the frame of the vehicle is about the same, but you have a bigger battery that requires some industrial processes to produce. But then every kilometer you drive on that car for a battery electric vehicle has no tailpipe emissions, but a gas car does. And those tailpipe emissions take up about three-quarters of the total vehicle emissions. So there's no question, definitely EVs win by a lot on the emission standpoint, and those kind of additional battery emissions are really quickly made up for, and that difference increases even more naturally the more you drive.
Thanks, Denise. Small commercial break where someone said, please mention the Clean Fuel Credits program, where a number of EV home charging companies offer free level 2 chargers and give cents back for charging per kilowatt hour. So I'm happy to tell that. They said, look into Grizzle, Peon, and Switch offering different versions of this program. And someone else in the chat said, make sure to mention that the federal EV rebate is actually $5,000 this year, and it's planned to decline $1,000 a year going forward. So now is a great time to get an EV. So happy to make that small commercial break on behalf of participants who can't make it themselves. I'm going to turn to a couple tougher questions here because I think people were asking a bit of questions about the grid. Like we're all thinking about electrification, but one question was around like trying to pull heat out of the air when it's minus 10 or minus 20. Heat pumps need a lot of like how much higher electricity demand to do this. Also, some concerns around the electricity grid in Ontario, in particular, not keeping pace with the expected electricity demand. Are we worried about that? And I think also around, particularly in Ontario, seeing whether there's going to be rising costs on electricity. So I'd maybe throw it to the floor to see if anyone want to kind of pitch in a little bit around any thoughts about what's going to be happening on the grid side of this, and if there are concerns or things that you'd like to share.
Uh, I guess I'll start high level. I mean, one thing to run with heat pumps, first of all, they're 3 to 5 times more efficient than other heating types, and they're not just replacing gas; they're replacing baseboards. And so the combination of that is the net increase in power demand may not be as significant because you're actually gaining so much on the baseboard side. Part of the way we need to use electricity in the future is smarter. And with distributed energy resources and a smarter grid, we can do things like control for peak load, so you don't need to overbuild your system. This is an area Energy Canada is digging into, doing a lot of work on. This webinar is not focused on it, but it's a great question. It's something we're definitely thinking about. And again, it requires a slight rethinking of the way that energy works. In the near term, though, especially when it comes to EVs, they're not as big of a grid suck, I think, as some people think they are. I know that BC Hydro had previously projected when BC had a 90% EV sales mandate by 2030, no longer that high, but when they did, they projected that EVs would be 2% of electricity demand by 2030. Obviously, as you get into the 2040s to 2050, that gets a lot higher. Remember, actual inventory of EVs on the road is always lagging the sales numbers that you see. So even with these aggressive, EV sales targets, the inventory is lagging that. And so you really do have a long lead time for that increase in electricity demand. And during that time, we're going to make the grid smarter and better.
Thanks, Trevor. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Yana, do you want to speak anything about efficiency of heat pumps and interaction with the grid?
Yeah, so as Trevor said, 3 to 5 times more efficient over a year, so over a heating season rather. Um, and I think part of that smart grid story is thinking about how can we leverage a lot of these electric technologies that we're bringing into people's homes. So yes, if we're all getting EVs and we're all gonna want to supercharge them from fully empty to fully full at top speed, then we're gonna need a massive grid. But what if we are a little smarter about it and we plan for it and we do that during off-peak hours and some similar things can be done for heating and cooling as well because our homes retain some heat. So we can think about shifting when we heat and cool to respond to those peak moments as well.
Thanks, Yana. All right, I'm gonna throw to one fun one, I think, to end it off. And just someone asked, which technology do you guys subscribe to on a personal note? Heat pumps, EVs, others? And maybe before pitching it over, I'd say, I think honestly, one of the things we need to be telling people is people are going to make these decisions in their own time. And so, when it comes time, as I think Yana said on the webinar, it's good to have people informed and know if they can make this kind of decision, whether it's an electrified option is going to make sense for them. So that's part of the reason that we're really excited to have people explore My Clean Bill now so that they have the information in advance of any day in the future they might want to purchase. But I will say personally, I am a EV driver and I am part of those 90% who would recommend it and will never go back. And I actually just moved into somewhere with a partial heat pump system and am enjoying my new benefits of even cooling.
I mean, I can go next, and unfortunately, this might be a very biased group, but I think what is really great about the past year is that we've really seen this interest in EVs pick up. I think a lot of people are really paying attention to how the gas prices could really affect EV savings, especially with new EV models coming in, and so it's been really nice to see that enthusiasm because I do think EVs are one of the biggest opportunities for Canada. We're such a big country. If we're going to drive, let's use the power that we produced.
And we only got 1 minute left, so you got to disclose quickly if you're going to disclose here.
I want to throw in well, not a heat. I love heat pumps, but as someone who actually lives in an apartment, um, I think sometimes it's the small benefits. So for me, I moved to a new apartment and we have an induction stove now. And one of the things that I really like about it is that I don't have to clean all around the gas thingies anymore. And I can just wipe it all clean in one go. And sometimes it's those little benefits about why technology is just better, is just because it makes my life a whole lot easier. And honestly, my kitchen a little bit cleaner because it's a lot easier to motivate myself to keep that clean.
I'll give the obvious answer. I mean, not to knock on hot water tanks, but something about an electric car. I live in a place, live in the Sunshine Coast in BC. There's no merge lanes in our highways. So you have to make a hard turn onto the highway and just get up to speed with traffic. It's the same when you're leaving the ferry parking lot. You got to turn into the exiting traffic and just get up to speed. And I love that I can do that so effortlessly. It's honestly a practical benefit. And yeah, at the same time, when I'm at an intersection and there's a loud truck beside me, and I know that guy wants to speed, and I can just zoom ahead so effortlessly, with such this quiet power. I'll never stop enjoying that feeling.
I'm in my usual situation of having to cut Trevor off when he's talking about electric vehicles, but we are at time. I'm really excited to have so many people so engaged with this subject matter. That's all we have time for today. I know there's lots of questions on methodology we didn't get to. Don't hesitate to go to the very back page of the Back in the Race report. It has lots of details about how we chose to calculate all that went into our new website and report. Apologies if we couldn't answer your question. Thank you again, and we will be sending you that follow-up email shortly. And wherever you are, have a great rest of your day.